Thank you very much, everyone, for your time this morning. I want to welcome you on behalf of the European University Institute, the Florence School of Banking and Finance, and the ERC-funded project ECOINT, or 20th Century International Economic Thinking. So the title of that project should give you some clue as to why we're here. This is the second in a series of talks that we're doing and archiving to have online as a record with women economists working in international organisations. So last year we had a really interesting discussion with Carmen Reinhardt at the World Bank, and this year it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Beata Javorcik at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And today really my job is going to be just to introduce Dr. Johanna Garcia-Morin, who's a postdoc in our project and who will be conducting the interview. It's been her work that's got, in conjunction with Professor Thorsten Beck, that has been able to organise Professor Javorcik's visit. Johanna is a postdoctoral fellow here in the ECOINT project. She received her PhD in International History at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva in 2021. She's taught for 2 years in the Global History Lab program in Princeton, and her new book will trace the global history of financial deregulation from a gender and post-colonial perspective. And she's published a lot of articles on the debt crisis, economic reforms, and the history of economic thinking, all of which make me very grateful to have her in our project. And today she's going to introduce Professor Javorcik to you all and work with me to have a discussion with Professor Javorcik about her career in international organisations and her own international economic thinking. So thank you, Johanna. I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Beata, for being here. So Beata Javorcik, you are Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. And you're currently on leave from the University of Oxford, where you were the first woman to hold Statutory Professorship in economics. You're also a fellow at All Souls College at Oxford and the director of the International Trade Programme at the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London, which is an independent, non-partisan, pan-European non-profit organisation. You're a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee at EIFO Institute for Economic Research at the University of Munich, one of Germany's largest economic think tanks, as well as of the Executive and Supervisory Committee of the Economics Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Before taking up your position at Oxford, you worked at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., where you focused on research, lending operations, and policy advice. And you hold a PhD in economics from Yale and a BA in economics from the University of Rochester. We're very honored to have you here today, and we were really afraid that you could not make it because of all the storms in Tuscany these days. And I would like to take advantage of your presence to get to know you, your journey, and your vision of contemporary geoeconomics a little bit better. In this interview, we will talk about your mission in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the bank's role in tackling today's major climate, development, and geopolitical challenges. And then I will open the floor to questions from the public. But first, to begin, can you tell us more about yourself, how you came to study economics in the United States in the 1990s, and why you decided to specialize in international trade economics?
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here, and in particular in this very striking venue. So to your question, I first went to the US in 1988 as a high school exchange student. So remember, 1988, that is the time before the Berlin Wall came down. My hometown in Poland, Krakow, was a sister city of Rochester, New York. And there was an exchange program. 2 students every year could go and visit a US high school, and then the idea was that somebody from the US would come for a year, though that did not happen until many years later. And because the daughter of the city's mayor was in my high school got these 2 spots, and I went to the US with the 3rd cohort. And that's how my sort of adventure with the US started. I returned back for 1 year, finished my high school. But while I was in the US, I completely by accident came across a private foundation that sponsored foreign students, and they offered me a scholarship. So that's how I ended up getting my bachelor's degree at the University of Rochester. The foundation restricted the choices of recipients. They had to actually stay in the area. Now, why economics? This was a very exciting time. End of history, communists fell, democracies, market-based economics was what the system that has won. The question was, how do you transform centrally planned economies into market-based economies? So it was an exciting discipline. And because socialist and communist countries did not have well-developed economics as a discipline, simply because it was such a politicized field, it seemed like a very good area to study. And when I think about what I'm doing now, working for an institution whose original mandate was to take these centrally planned countries and help them transition to a market-based system, it very much echoes that feeling from back then.
This is amazing, and I wonder if these discussions about the transition from planned economies to market economies was overwhelming in your economist cycles when you were studying in the US at that time. Was it something that was really, that people were conscious of? And do you remember if you had yourself a specific vision of where you and your cohorts were imagining these economies to, what point they were arriving to, or the different paths that they could have taken and that they maybe did not, or?
Well, I think you give perhaps too much credit to me as a 19-year-old being a college student. So let me mention to you. So actually, undergrad studies were exciting because I was learning a lot of things about how markets work. That was something that was very different. When I was growing up, initially there were only one type of price when you went shopping in a sort of official store. There was the regulated government set price. And then in the late 80s, there was some price liberalization, and then the shops had to mark the prices, and they had to specify whether this was a government-regulated price or whether this was the deregulated price. And not surprisingly, the deregulated prices were higher. So, I started sort of from a very different base. Then when I moved to graduate program, I thought, well, okay, now we're really going to learn something real about the reforms. And then, studying international trade, we were learning about country A and B exchanging infinite number of goods. That was, more than 2 degrees removed from reality. But when I started my graduate school, it was with a sort of future career in mind, meaning I actually wanted to work for multilateral development institutions. And my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, Andy Bernard, still recalls the time when he asked me, where do you want to be in 10 years? And I said, I want to be at the World Bank. And he said, yes, I'm going to help you write the dissertation that would get you a job at the World Bank. And he delivered on that.
Thank you for this great transition, because really we're so interested in these kind of trajectories of women economists who were both in academia and in international organizations. So I understand that the opportunity to actually work at the World Bank was actually a dream and you worked for it, and so it just did not happen to you like this. But I really want to understand how your work in a multilateral organization informed your academic work and vice versa, because I understood you created all your career a bit in between these two professional environments.
So just to sort of give you the context, when as a PhD student, when I went on the market, I also had academic offers, and but I chose the World Bank. That was my favorite. That was what I wanted to do. But when faculty members would stop me on campus and they would say, "So, where are you going?" and I would say, "To the World Bank," they would say, "Oh, yeah." Yeah, and they were thinking, well, you probably did, you crashed and bombed on the job market, and that was that, and that gives you a sense of how different the academic world is from the MDB world, right? In the MDB world, the system gives you an incentive to focus on policy-relevant questions. I mean, you have a lot of freedom what you can research as long as it is vaguely related to developing countries. And I was fortunate enough to be in the research department of the World Bank. But you very early understand that there is a lot of premium on answering questions that are relevant to the institution, simply because you get a bit of an institutional glory. People are interested. People are always in a market for ideas. So if you can give them ideas that are relevant to their work, that they can sell to governments, that's always an advantage. These institutions, such as World Bank, help you collect a lot of data. There's very little premium and credit you get, at least in the economics profession, for data collection, right? You're expected to have amazingly great data, but you get actually very little credit for data collection. And then there's always, a reality check. So if you are giving a seminar at the World Bank and you talk about a particular country or you use data from a particular country, chances are there always will be a few people in the room who know that country. And if you go terribly wrong with your assessment of what's happening in the country, they will point it out. And this reality check is extremely useful. And of course, there is also a lot of premium on empirical work. While, academic world values theory much more than empirics, academic world, the incentives are different. The incentives in academia are to publish well, and that means that relevance is not a criterion. And sadly, in my own discipline, subdiscipline, international trade, I think we have shifted to an equilibrium where, we have these beautiful models which we calibrate, and, we get some number, welfare goes up by 3%. But by necessity, these models cannot capture the complexity of the world. And for most policymakers, they are useless. It's a bit like poetry. They are beautiful, and every time you look at them, you see something different. But usefulness is not something that is being rewarded. Also in academia, at least in economics, there is a premium on answering questions very well, and that's a good thing. But that also means that you choose your questions depending on whether or not you can answer them well, right? And unkind people would say, for instance, that randomized control trial revolution that has swept through the field has shifted incentives, to give more and more precise answers, to less and less important questions, because these are the questions you can answer well. And you would not even attempt to answer a question that may be incredibly important, but you cannot answer well.
Well, that's amazing, and I want to drive a parallel with the work we're doing here with our ECOINT project as historians, because we seek to understand exactly that, how unique international organizations are in producing economic thinking compared to other spheres of economic knowledge production. And we have observed throughout the 20th century that international organizations fostered the development of original thinking also because they gave opportunities to people who did not have opportunities in the academic field in economics, namely women or people coming from developing regions. And because they could develop their own questions, or they could also, in their empirical work, ask questions a bit differently from the classical paradigms or concepts that are used in economics in academia. I think, and this is the work we are trying to push for, is that they brought new questions that in the end influenced academia, because obviously they nurtured a public debate that kind of pressured academia to also ask itself new questions in economic. And we're going to maybe talk a bit more in details in the specific case of the EBRD, about a few examples, but also in general, also in the World Bank. I wonder if you perceive that, how you have new generations or new profiles of economists within international organizations that could push for new topics, new problems, new questions that you did not really encounter in academia.
So what an organization like the World Bank could do was, first of all, you created a critical mass of people in a particular area of economics. So if you are a trade economist like I am, and you are in a mid-sized department, you may be the only or maybe one of the two trade economists. At the time when I was at the World Bank, we were, I think, probably 10 PhD trade economists. So that's actually important because you immediately have people to talk to. And perhaps the difference is not just between, hiring versus non-hiring women. Economics is a very male-dominated profession. And yes, MDBs were much earlier cognizant of the need for diversity than economics department. Just to give you an example, at some point at Oxford, I found myself as one of two females among 50 faculty members. And this is sort of, for the first time in my life, I realized, well, that's odd. Right? And thankfully, the world has changed, and now we have many more women at Oxford, but in Oxford economics. But where MDBs make a difference is by giving people freedom to ask questions they want, questions they think are important, rather than questions that are fashionable in the profession. Right? And that they have the freedom to do that because they are not subject to tenure. Right? And they are not slaves to citations. And of course, there is premium within these institutions on publishing well, and the incentives are structured to publish well, but it's not a must. So the environment fosters more freedom. So you would ask questions that perhaps wouldn't be of interest, of immediate interest to most academics. I remember during my time there, there was a lot of interest in whether investment promotion agencies are effective as sort of tools of industrial policy. Now, answering that question is not easy because it's not random which countries sets up an investment promotion agency, how well this investment promotion agency works. So in order to answer that question well, it was ideal to have information on sectors that were considered as priority industries for each investment promotion agency. And then one could use the data to isolate the effect of activities of those agencies from everything else that was happening in the country by simply looking whether the sectors that were subject to increased efforts were getting more investment than other sectors. And that allowed you to econometrically take out a lot of confounding effects. But in order to answer such a question, you had to collect that information. And that was not easy because it's something that required contacting these agencies one at a time and having many conversations with them. So that's an example of a question you could ask there.
Do you remember specific stories of data collection that was complicated because maybe people needed to create collaborations on the ground, or?
So I remember, one of my first missions at the World Bank was to Lithuania. So I was in Vilnius. So, right now, we have access to enormous wealth of data. So the seminar I'm giving later today is based on data where I can see connections between all firms in Turkey. I can see transactions between them. In the, 20 years ago, we were struggling to get firm-level data. So I remember being in Vilnius, and this was a World Bank mission, and my task was to say something about firm performance and particularly firms' involvement in international trade, in FDI. And with my colleagues, we had these repeated conversations. Could you please give us access to your firm-level data? And the statistical office was incredibly resistant, and it took, 4 meetings to get the data. And what we realized, by meeting 3 was they were worried that we were going to recalculate their GDP statistics. And that's why they didn't want to release the data. But once we assured them that that was not our purpose, we got the data. And that was, that allowed me to look at a question that wasn't controversial at the time, namely the question whether FDI was bringing knowledge to recipient countries. And it was controversial because there was a very incredibly widely cited paper by Ann Harrison and Brian Aitken, and that paper was showing that in Venezuela, entry of FDI was leading to lower performance in terms of productivity of domestic firms. So Lithuanian data allowed me to revisit the question, but focus, rather than focusing on firms competing with multinationals, to look at what impacts multinationals have on sectors supplying inputs. Right? And that one could see a positive impact. And that was something that was quite novel at that time.
And I imagine that participated in the transition, specifically of these countries, of the economies of these countries, which brings me to talk more about your current position now at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Europe. And just for our audience, I just want to very briefly remind the origin of this organization that was created in 1991 after the Berlin Wall fell and the collapse of communist regimes. And if I'm correct, it was initially designed by Jacques Attali, one of the former advisor of the then French President François Mitterrand, a socialist, but that had very interesting agenda for Europe at that time. And the whole purpose of the bank was to help countries from Central and Eastern Europe to transition to market economies and open economies. But now the bank has evolved a lot because it's not just implemented in Eastern Europe, it's also implemented in Central Asia. As you pointed out, it's also fostering development programs in countries that have no communist legacy. So it had to evolve in its design and in its definition of its own purpose. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how it functions and what is your role? What is the role of a chief economist in such an organization?
So let me start with the initial premise on which the EBRD was set up. It is a much younger MDB than the World Bank, than many others. So it was set up with a very progressive mission because the mission was specified in terms of systemic change. Right? Its mission, as spelled out in the Articles of Establishment, is to foster transition to free market, through promoting private sector, through promoting openness to trade, through promoting resilience, and environmental soundness, so environmental sustainability and sound approach to environment. So we are talking 1991. That's a very progressive mission. And in the early days of the EBRD, it was very easy what had to be done. It was about dismantling the system of regulated prices. It was about privatization. But then by the mid-1990s, the question came, how do we know that what the institution is doing makes sense? And the transition concept was formalized by the chief economist back then, Nick Stern, who said transition is about, or transition as interpreted as the EBRD mission, is about creating markets and development of markets. It's about supporting institutions that support markets and promoting behaviors that are consistent with markets. And that was the lens through which every project at the EBRD was being evaluated. Right? Because if you think about how EBRD thinks about its projects, well, these projects are supposed to follow sound banking principles, right? We want our money back because we give loans, not grants. We want to be additional. So in other words, we want to be somewhat reassured that the project would not have happened had we not been involved. And third, we want to make sure that each project has this transition impact. So this was the lens in the 1997. By later, so after the financial crisis, by 2015, there was a realization that this concept needs updating. And I was part of a commission, which included Tim Besley and my predecessor, Sergei Gurev, that took that concept and thought, okay, how do we make it fit for the new times? So remember, after the global financial crisis, economics profession started talking more about the fact that markets left to themselves will not always create optimal outcomes. So the commission that revised the EBRD transition concept said, well, we should be thinking about transition in terms of characteristics of desirable characteristics of the endpoint, of the economy that has completed the transition process, realizing that there isn't a single model to which these countries are going. And we started thinking in terms of 6 transition qualities. So the desirable characteristics include being competitive, being well-governed, being resilient to shocks, being integrated both within country as well as outside countries, being green and being inclusive. So, if you think about in terms of ESG, you see the green, inclusive, well-governed. This is echoed there. And every project we do now speaks to one of those, one or more transition qualities.
Do you remember who championed these new concepts, these new ideas to redefine a bit the transition concept? I'm asking this question because, once again, when you study the history of an organization, you always discover that new ideas are never the result of a consensus in a committee. It will always be championed by specific people who will try to push for the new ideas within the organization, and eventually they will kind of win in a little ID battle within the organization. So maybe there was no battle, but this was a bit why I asked before about new profiles or maybe new generations of economists or...
Well, you know, that change in the definition of the transition concept actually it was like an earthquake in some ways for the institution, right? So our commission came up with the concept in 2015. In 2019, I came to the EBRD as the chief economist, and I was amazed how every discourse, every board document, every report included these transition qualities. And I thought I joined a cult, not an IFI. So in that case, the change had to come from the very top. You cannot change the organization organically, sort of from bottom up. Now, I mean, the redefinition of transition concept was not that far from the Articles of Establishment from 1991, which I cited, but it changed the way projects are done. But it also corresponded to the times. As you know, in mid-2010s, people started talking more about ESG, more emphasis was put on green economy. So the institution also responded to what its shareholders wanted.
If I could ask a follow-up question, this is so interesting. I mean, to what extent does the European part of the bank then retain its relevance? Is it as a touch point for certain kinds of agendas, or because in the transition, you not only change mission, but also I think over the years, the stakeholders, and not only the objects of funding or the locations of funding have broadened beyond Europe, but also the stakeholders are not European, right? They're from all over the world. And so what is the European component, do you think, now of this bank?
So we are a multilateral development institution. We have 71 shareholding countries, also EU as a whole, as a shareholder, and the European Investment Bank. More than 50% of shares belong to the European Union countries or institutions, right? But of course, US and Japan are also, Canada are also significant shareholders. So in a sense, what we do is a function of what our shareholders want us to do and of their preferred policies and areas where they would like to see more MDB involvement.
And do you see any relationship between and across banks like the World Bank and the EBRD in terms of noticing what the other is doing? And if you're both identified as multilateral institutions?
So the big difference between us and the World Bank is that the World Bank lends to governments, while in our case, 3/4 of lending goes directly to private sector. Right? So we are most similar to the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank group. Now, because we focus on private sector lending, we, for instance, are not active in health or education, right? Two areas where the World Bank itself is very active. Because we originally focused on post-communist countries, privatization is something that has been very important to us, or management or governance of state-owned enterprises, because still in many countries, if you look at post-communist countries, they still tend to have a higher share of employment in public sector than countries of similar income levels. So it's a much more important issue to us. But then there are these big sort of areas where there is a lot of interest in getting MDBs involved. Some MDBs are more nimble than others. Their actions are also a reflection of shareholding. So if you think about the World Bank came to climate issues much later. We, a few years ago, already set a target of 50% of our lending being directed to green economy. So in a sense, we thought about this somewhat earlier, reflecting greater interest in that area within Europe.
And because the span of possibilities is so large, the geography of your lending is so large, what is the method, or what is the practice to screen projects, to choose projects? And I imagine the differences between how you pick a project in Lithuania or how you pick a project in Turkmenistan, for example, is so different.
So I outlined the sort of three steps, right? Sound banking, additionality, and transition impact. That is something that is assessed at the project level. But then, there's a question: how do you steer this giant ship, right? The EBRD into the desirable direction? How do you reach the goal of having, for instance, 50% of lending being directed to green economy? So you do that by having targets, essentially. So there's something called corporate scorecard, where we have this target: 75% of lending to private institutions, 50% to green, 30% of project having some gender component. We have also some steer in the scorecard as to the geography. So for instance, some preference for early transition countries, meaning countries that have made less progress in transition. And that is then cascaded down to the banking departments. Our banking departments specialize in different areas, and to the level of individual bankers. Right? So in a sense, you want to create incentives for people to find projects that, as I said, are in private sector, or projects that speak to climate. And that works, right? And we are opportunistic in a sense that we need to have a client that is interested in working with us. And we are not the easiest institution to work with because we have very high standards, right? So we require a lot of information from our clients, both on all the sort of aspects of ESG as well.
And if I may ask a very broad question, but what do you think is the ideal, the horizon that you're pursuing there? Is it to push all countries to kind of catch up and close the gap with the most developed open market economies? Or what is the big vision behind all this work?
So the big vision is that we want to improve people's lives by promoting systemic change, right? So we are not about alleviating poverty. We are not about creating jobs. We are about systemic change. So in other words, pushing these countries on a better trajectory where they would be able to grow and at the end of the day improves people's lives, right? So what we do is, now it's not only about projects, it's also about policy dialogue. And policy dialogue is needed to unlock some opportunities for projects. So, if you think about green economy, you want to promote production of renewables. But if you want private sector to invest in renewables, you need to have the legal framework that would guide, how renewable energy is supplied into the grid. So we work with governments to create such frameworks, for instance. It's about mobilizing private investments. When we invest, we often invest with private investors from advanced economies because we serve as a seal of approval, right? So it's about sort of putting countries on a better trajectory. And their problems and challenges differ. In some countries, it may be the still large state-owned sector. In some countries, it may be aging populations. In some countries, it may be high dependence on fossil fuels. So these countries are different, but the objective is tailored to the local needs.
And there is one country, and we are obviously not going to cover the whole topic right now, but there is one country that is going through a very specific situation, which is Ukraine, and the EBRD is very involved in supporting the Ukrainian economy. So maybe without going into the length of all the activities you're doing there, I'm interested in understanding what kind of reconstruction the EBRD is imagining for Ukraine, and how the work you're doing right now in Ukraine is supporting the vision of the after economy, if I may ask this question, or maybe this is too early to talk about this, I don't know, but what is the vision of the Chief Economist on that?
So, everybody agrees that the process of reconstruction of Ukraine is about building back better, right? So everybody agrees with that. But, before we get to the reconstruction phase, we need to help Ukraine function now, right? And so what we so far between last year and 2 years and this year, we've deployed 3 billion euros in Ukraine. We were the first MDB that took a lot of risk on our books, partially thanks to guarantees. So we took half of the risk on our books, half was guaranteed by shareholding countries. Initially, our priority was emergency financing. So, financing emergency purchases of gas when Ukraine was cut off from Russian supplies. Then, as winter rolled in, we financed emergency repairs of infrastructure after infrastructure was bombed. We continue doing that. We continue working, supporting the energy sector. We support international trade transactions, so import and export through trade finance instruments. We have been helping with building solidarity lanes that would help take grain out of Ukraine. We support agribusiness. We helped the Ukposhta to finance internet satellite links to get internet connections and have generators so people could go and charge their phones and get internet access. And the logic here is that by helping make conditions as bearable as possible, we are helping Ukraine preserve human capital in the country. So we are helping people survive there rather than leave. Because, the discourse about reconstruction is always about how much money is needed. But what you really need equally much is human capital. You need people so that when the moment for reconstruction comes, the country will be well positioned for that. Now, let me inject a little bit of realism into the discourse about reconstruction. So in our last transition report, which is what my department produces, we looked at 200 years of wars, and we focused on wars between states where the fighting was taking place on the territory of a country in question. And then we asked, what happens after the war? And we compared what happened in those countries to what happened in other countries that were similar in terms of population size, income, and growth. And essentially what you see is, reconstruction should not be taken for granted, right? In half of the cases, countries don't go back to the pre-war GDP per capita trajectory quarter of a century later. Right? And if you think about the reconstruction of Japan, which was widely hailed as a success, it took 15 years. If you think, so what we also did is then we looked at what explains the speed of this rebound back to the pre-war growth trajectory. And what we saw was that external financing explains only, so ability of funding, I shouldn't say external, ability of funding explains only 10% of variation in how long the reconstruction takes. There are many other things that are important. And, think about Afghanistan, where the US poured $120 billion. Think about Iraq, where $1 billion. Iraq, where I think $225 billion were poured. Reconstruction in these two places did not succeed. So you need something else. Institutions are one of the key components. So even now, when we talk to Ukrainian authorities, we try to support them in institutional reform. Before the war, we helped set up a procurement system called Prozoro. It was an electronic procurement system that would publish a lot of information about tenders, about results, who won, and prices, in order to increase transparency. We continue working on that. Before the war, we had a program on Ukrainian institutional infrastructure where we placed Western educated Ukrainians in various ministries. So we try to continue with that because the institutional part is equally important as financing. But of course, when the time comes, we are ready to invest a lot in Ukraine, and our board, in order to support us in that, has agreed to a capital increase, and that is currently going through the motions.
Amazing, thank you. I think I could ask you questions for the whole day, but I want to open the floor to questions from the public before we do.
I can go around with the mic and pick it up if there are any questions. Maybe introduce yourself again.
Yes. So, good morning. I'm Guilherme Sampaio. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in ECOINT. So I'm a colleague of Joanna and Elizabeth Banks here to my left. One of the things we're very interested in the project is actually the UN and the regional economic commissions of the UN, like Europe, the European one, which actually was founded, the idea of fostering development, and in economic cooperation between West and East. So my question would be simply if you could tell us more about the relations you maintain with the UN at large and with the regional economic commissions. Thank you very much.
I'm afraid I probably don't have that much to say about this, as in my 4-year tenure so far, I have not encountered that much cooperation. But you also have to remember that EBRD is a small institution, so 90% of my colleagues are bankers. My tiny department is, I think, one is like a minister research department. We also do the projections. So we don't have the scale of the World Bank to produce a lot of reports. And actually EBRD does very little in terms of sort of analysis of countries, of operations.
Yeah, hi, Beata, thank you so much. This is really terrific. I have two very quick questions for you. One is, you trained as a trade economist, but the world seems to have changed its attitude about the virtues of trade and about the virtues of trade economists. So I wonder if you would reflect on that. Do you think that the world has just missed the plot, or do you think that there is something that we didn't understand about trade that we know better now? That would be the first question. And the second question is, if you were to advise someone who wanted to go into a future in multilateral development banks, what would you recommend they study at the doctoral level?
Okay. Well, let me start with the second question. If they are, so I would advocate as the first best economics, simply because of it giving more options. IMF has 1,000 PhD economists. The World Bank has a lot of economists. Regional development banks have a lot of economists. But of course, that's not the only thing you can study, because the World Bank has health specialists, engineers, MBAs, and so on. But the number of jobs is simply, I think, smaller. And then if you think about what type of economics, I would say anything related to environment would be a winner, and is going to be a winner, I would think, for the next decade. Now, on the globalization question, I don't think that the profession has missed the plot. I think the world has changed, right? I was talking about the end of history. Now we have return of history, right? We find ourselves in a world where geopolitics trumps economic considerations. And I'm afraid that we are on a path to fragmentation. If you think about Trump trade war, when Europe increased tariffs on China, and these were substantial tariffs, right, 20–25%. This was perceived in Europe as an aberration, right, as something that was specific to Trump administration. The administration changed, tariff stayed. If there is one thing that two parties on Capitol Hill agree on, is their stance on China. There are other pieces of legislation. Think about the US CHIPS Act, which limits transfer of technology from the US to China. China responded to that by restricting exports of germanium and gallium to metals or minerals, of which China controls more than 90% of production. Right, and 2 weeks ago, China slapped export restrictions on graphite, another critical mineral. Now, what we see happening now is Europe picking up the same narrative, and you hear a lot of conversations in Brussels and in Berlin about Europe following US's lead in restricting technology flows to China, screening investments, going outward investment, inward investment. And that to me is very worrisome, because while originally the European plan, the strategic autonomy, was about finding access to critical raw materials, securing access, I worry that if Europe goes on that path, China will respond with more export restrictions. 5 years ago, only 5% of critical raw materials were under export restrictions. Last year, it was 30%. So this is sort of one path of fragmentation. Then we see big changes around Russia. So Europe and the US saw a dramatic decline in exports to Russia. That was by design due to sanctions. Some of that export is being rerouted via Central Asia and Caucasus, but in terms of volumes, it's a just small part of what used to happen. When Europe exited, Turkey and China stepped up and increased exports to Russia. The third thing we are seeing is changes to currencies of invoicing. So for instance, a decade ago, 5% of Chinese exports to Russia, or 10% of Chinese exports to Russia were denominated in renminbi. Now it's 2/3. Moreover, you see third countries denominating their exports to Russia in renminbi. And these are particularly countries that are not party to sanctions, countries that have swap lines with People's Bank of China. So while the dominance of the US dollar has made sanctions more effective, sanctions may in the long run lead to undermining of the dominance. So we see big changes globally in terms of patterns of trade and other aspects of globalization.
Thanks. Actually I have kind of two half questions and then a full question. The first, more related to your work at the EBRD, and maybe also in comparison. You mentioned earlier the EBRD is not exactly like other IFIs or MDBs, as it is actually private sector lending, not official lending. And you mentioned 95% or so are bankers of the staff, or 90%. Does that make a difference in the work environment? World Bank, EBRD. And of course, I understand that when you were at the World Bank, or when we were at the World Bank, of course, we were at a much more junior level than you are now at the EBRD. But so I would be interested in kind of knowing how you compare these work environments. And number two, also related to EBRD, so there is this current kind of expansion towards North Africa, outside the traditional kind of geography of the EBRD. Will that change the approach, the kind of the objectives or the work environment in the EBRD? So these are kind of the more work-related questions. And then the kind of more personal question I have is, if you could talk to your younger self 24 years ago? Yes, 24 years ago, when you joined the Young Professional Program at the World Bank, what would you like to have known back then that you know now about World Bank, EBRD, about the work and career, but also influence, impact, and so on? Thanks.
Well, all excellent questions. How are the two institutions different? So for those of you who know the World Bank, yes, EBRD is like IFC. So it's really about lending, it's about projects, it's not about writing reports. Right? So at the World Bank, there are lots of, the small army of people writing various reports, poverty reduction strategies, various types, public expenditure reviews, various types of analysis. At the EBRD, we have country sector strategies, and that's about it. And these country sector strategies are needed really to sort of outline what we want, and this is sort of based on a dialogue with the government, what we want to achieve. But we don't do analysis for analysis' sake, because that's not our mission. So everything is very project-driven. If there is analysis that's being done, it's typically done by consultants, and it's about specific area which is related to the project. So if the project is about renewable energy, it is about, how to adjust the legal framework in a way that's needed. Similar, it's about, issuing a new type of financial instrument. It's about how, again, the legal framework needs to change so that instrument would be allowed. And that's, so policy dialogue is very targeted, and that's a sort of different mentality. It's sort of about doing things much faster. So that's one part of the question. In terms of, what my younger self, oh my God, that's a hard one. Now let me just say that I was no stranger to the EBRD. So my dissertation was actually written based on EBRD data. In the mid-1990s, EBRD did a survey of multinationals asking them whether they were interested in investing in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. I found some description of that survey and I called up EBRD and I said, well, could you share the data with me? And they said, sure, but you need to come and work for us in the summer. And that's what I did, right? In almost a quarter of a century ago. And then, later I found myself in the same department, on the same floor, right, as the chief economist. So I felt like, I'm back to where I started. I will have to take a rain check on what I should have known. I think I probably would have told the younger myself, don't stress out so much. Things would work out, right?
Thank you. Yes, you just mentioned that you don't do analysis for the sake of analysis at the EBRD. However, you mentioned that study of 200 years of wars and reconstructions after wars. So a couple of questions about that, which I'm quite intrigued. It's very interesting. Was that for analysis for the sake of analysis? Does it guide you when you're involved into financing projects for reconstruction? And then that might be too much time, but I imagine you've disaggregated. I mean, you've said 25 years to come back to GDP before war, but I suppose there are huge differences between periods, between countries, level of development, the length of war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So can you just say a little bit more about the status of this study and maybe how it's used and a word about the results?
So thank you very much for that question. So we don't do analysis for the sake of analysis. We try, but there's one exception, right? And not quite. So that exception is our transition report. This is an annual, this is our answer to the World Development Report, done with a much smaller budget, much smaller team. It's a big glossy report which we put out every year. It is done by my department, and just to give you a sense of magnitude, we are 20 people, including the budget person, assistants, research assistants. So we are a very, very small team. So every year we produce a report that tries to inform thinking in our countries of operations as well as within the institution. Last year, because of the war on Ukraine, we wanted to contribute to the internal or external debate on reconstruction. And we thought, what can we do? Well, we can look at the data. So that was the reason for that. And in a sense, the big conclusion that, maybe an obvious conclusion that emerged from that was, money is not everything, right? Because remember, very early on, there were all these conferences on rebuilding Ukraine, and figures that were floating were enormous. The first conference floated the figure of 750 billion. That was the figure Ukrainian authorities came with. So another example, so that report as well looked at reshaping of global value chain last year. We also did an exercise, what if the world were to break into two blocks along the lines of UN voting, condemning the attack on Ukraine. And these two blocks would see an increase in trade costs on the order of 20%, right? What would happen? Well, any trade economists know what would happen. Everybody would lose, pretty much. So we, IMF did similar, perhaps more sophisticated analysis half a year after us, and this is one of the messages Kristalina Georgieva is promoting very much. We thought about this as well, and I'm glad to say we thought about this a bit earlier. 3 years before, so during COVID, we had a report entitled "The State Strikes Back," right? Because we saw sort of increased role of the state during the pandemic. And there, for instance, we documented, we did an analysis of legal frameworks guiding governance of state-owned enterprises. And that was, just framework on the books, not even enforcement, right? And the picture was not very pretty. In our countries of operations, even the regulation is very far away from where it should be. And we pointed out that, there is nothing in many countries that prevents SOEs getting unfair advantage over private sector, for instance, by having lower tax rates, access to subsidized input, and so on and so forth, right? And that was also an excuse for some conversation within the institution about how we score projects that involved state-owned entities in terms of transition impact. We also had a study in that report which looked at lending in Turkey. And essentially that study documented that state-owned banks tend to pump credit to regions where local elections are closely contested and where the incumbent is aligned with the central party, while withdrawing credit from other locations. And that was another warning we wanted to give to the rest of the institution. State-owned banks can do good things, but there is this political aspect. So again, we need to stay vigilant when we lend to state-owned banks.
Hello, yeah, it works. Thank you so much for sharing your experience today. It's been really interesting to hear all your thoughts. And I have a question hoping to maybe pick your brain a bit more as it concerns your experience and thoughts. My name is Emma and I'm a second-year PhD researcher within history. So I'm a very more junior researcher starting out my academic journey. My research topic is Swedish development aid from the 1960s to the early 1990s, so just the sort of the advent of the EBRD. And I was wondering, based on your experience, if you could share some thoughts on actually something that I grapple with within my sources, which is the discourse or sort of the schools of thoughts that concern within development the employment of credit versus the employment of grants. And I was wondering, based on your perspective and your experience, if you could share what you believe are the benefits or indeed the disadvantages of engaging in credit within the way, as you were saying, the EBRD is engaged in giving loans, so credit, rather than grants, versus this alternative school of thought that sort of has been existing over the last 60 years of the employment of development aid or development through grants. Thank you.
So let me tell you a bit more. So I'm not sure I have a view on on the big question. There's always the fiscal sustainability angle. There is always the angle of incentives, right? There is a third way, and this is what we also do, which is called blended finance. So we lend, but the interest rate is lower than what we would normally lend at. And this is needed as a sweetener when you ask the recipient to do a lot, right? And of course, one needs to have a framework within an institution that somehow puts limits on blended finance, right? Because otherwise, if you think about bankers, right, from an incentive of an individual banker, it's great to lower the interest rate. So you need to have some sort of a framework that prevents from happening. Now, why do you need sometimes also blended finance? Is we are very tough as a lending institution. We ask a lot of our customers, of our clients. We ask a lot in terms of ESG. And most of our projects are not using blended finance, but sometimes if you are asking somebody to have to follow the best standard there is, for instance, environmentally or environmental monitoring, that project may incur higher costs than their competitors, right? That's sort of one example that comes to my mind. So you need to create the right incentives for recipients to want to go to the higher standards. But this is at the level of sort of projects done with firms, right? So sort of in private sector.
Okay, maybe if I just ask one more question, because what I found really intriguing, and it also relates to our historical interests, I suppose, but and in some ways it maps onto your own trajectory. But the World Bank and your institution have different ways of approaching questions of reconstruction and development, but they do both take this development idea. And I wonder, in your own sense of the horizon that Johanna was talking about, what are the ends of this? Given the kind of range of countries that you lend, businesses in countries that you lend to, is there, do you think, a very distinctive or changing idea of development that's emerging that's not actually economic but more political? Because you do have now in your transition document, one of the conditions is that the money is tied in some way to multi-party democracy, for example. So that is a political objective. Is it something that defines the idea of development of the EBRD and makes it different or similar to other multilateral institutions?
So we are different from other MDBs because we have this political mandate in our articles of establishment. So we are not asked to promote democracy, but rather our articles specify that we should be promoting transition in countries committed to and applying the principles of multi-party democracy. Now, the way we think about this is that promoting development of private sector can contribute to greater democratization. And that can work through three channels. The first one is if a large share of your population is employed in public sector, right? And that's 7 percentage points higher in our countries than in others, post-communist countries, then it's easy to control people. Now, if you go back to the contested elections in Belarus, I think it was 2019, if I remember correctly, very easy to control people if 75% of employment is in public sector, right? So by promoting private sector development, we are making it harder for governments to directly control people through employment. Also, if you promote private sector markets serve as a check on governments, right? Even authoritarian governments are subject to market forces. You know, think about bond markets, you know, interest rates, exchange rates, and so on. They cannot, it's very hard to completely isolate yourself. So by promoting development of various markets within the country, we are also increasing, in a sense, checks on governments. And third is private sector development gives a way of, you know, it promotes growth, higher incomes, and higher incomes mean that people can travel, have access to other information that informs people. They think about, you know, if you live hand to mouth, you have very little bandwidth to think about something other than basic needs. So by promoting growth and higher incomes, we give people, in a sense, the freedom to think about other things.
Yeah, thank you. So I decided to ask my question because it's a nice follow-up to what you just discussed. So EBRD was present in Russia before the war. I don't think it's a surprise because it's a big market. So given what you said, would you say that there were too much support going to this market or too less? Or is it just a bad luck that everything played out this way so that all the loans and all the support that was going to private sector didn't help them then to build institutions that would be resilient and that could counteract the aggression that started? And in general, what lessons could be drawn from this experience to other countries of presence of the EBRD? What could be altered, how goals could be changed, or maybe it's all fine and it was just an exception. Yeah, thanks a lot.
So just to be clear, we stopped investing in Russia after annexation of Crimea and after attack on Ukraine. We closed down our office and we started withdrawing, closing our portfolio. I mean, look, history is non-linear, right? It's just not, you know, when we look at what's been happening in this transition path, countries make progress and then they go back. And I don't think that this invalidates the principle. I think that's all I can say. So, you know, if you look at our other countries of operations, Armenia and Azerbaijan, you know, the conflict between the two reignited. If you think about Kosovo and Serbia, there are lots of tensions there. You know, we work in very tough countries by design, in countries where the situation is difficult, and we think that in this way we make the world a better place. And yes, sometimes bad things happen, even though we were hoping that our investments would sort of put countries on a better trajectory. Not everything works, right?
Okay, so I think we've given you a very hard time with lots of questions, and it's so interesting to find out more about the world in which you live and institutions that you've, you know, been able to build your career around and also contribute to in major ways. So thank you very much for coming here today to be with us, Beata. So Professor Javorcik is also giving a talk at 3:00 over in Villa Schifanoia in the Capella on her own research. And I'm going to be in that, so if you'd like to join us. And perhaps if you just put your hands together and thank Professor Javorcik for her time today. Thank you. And thank you all for coming along. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.